railways transformed Britain. From town to town and city to city, the tracks spread. They changed the way we live forever. But there was a darker side to the advent of the railways. This technological revolution offered new opportunities for the oldest of crimes. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious murders ever to take place on the British railways. Stories of the men who killed, of the police who hunted them, and of the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and the railway police, this is the history of blood on the tracks of Britain. From the moment he set eyes on her, he was obsessed. In 1878, Violet Cameron was just 15, but she was already a star on the London stage. To 18-year-old Percy Lefroy Mapleton, she was perfect. He was a poor and sickly young man. Violet didn't even know he existed. But Lefroy was convinced they belonged together. He would go to any lengths to win her. He would lie for her. He would steal for her. And eventually, he would kill for her.
This is a man who lives so much in a fantasy world that he has virtually no sense of reality until it's too late.
He's the eternal schoolboy. It's all fantasy and wish fulfillment. He creates a whole fictitious romance.
He had a sense of being invisible, perhaps, as he was growing up, and a need to make something of himself.
Percy Lefroy Mapleton dreamed of becoming a writer, and he could certainly tell a tall tale. He posed as a young man of education and wealth. He told some people he was related to an earl. He claimed his father had been a prominent clergyman. To others, he was Belgian nobility or a partner in a grand firm of solicitors. In fact, Lefroy's father was an alcoholic Royal Navy captain who showed no interest in his son. And his mother died of tuberculosis when he was just 6 years old.
He was sent to live with an aunt and his two cousins. And there he was brought up for the next 14 years.
His chest was weak, his health was weak, so he was always a concern to his family in a way that ensured that the consequences of his actions don't seem to have been brought home to him as part of his growing up. He seems always to have indulged in petty deceptions, petty lies, and to have got away with it.
Here is someone who was rather invisible as a child, was desperate to make a mark in a world that had seemed so hostile, at least in his early years.
By 1881, Lefroy's obsession with the young actress Violet Cameron was utterly consuming him. He told relatives they were married. He haunted the theatres where she performed, and he even found out where she lived and followed her when she went out.
Lefroy wanted to become a theatre critic, and I think this is when he suddenly spotted or conceived this passion for Violet Cameron.
She'd been on the stage since she was about 8. She was a popular singer, and she would perform in light-hearted operettas.
It was one of the few professions where women almost sort of rivaled men in terms of the celebrity status that they could achieve.
Percy Lefroy Mapleton longed for her to be in his life. So she's the star that he's fixed his hopes on, that he hopes by some kind of ploy and machination to attain.
If only he could find a way into Violet's world, present himself as a man of means, a man of talent, then surely she would see his worth. She would be his. Lefroy concocted an ambitious scam. In March 1881, he wrote to theatre newspaper The Era. In his letter, Lefroy announced the existence of an unpublished comic opera written by Jacques Offenbach. The popular French-German composer was in no position to deny Lefroy's claim. He had conveniently died the previous year. Lefroy used the fake opera as bait. He weaseled his way into a friendship with the Welsh tenor and theatre manager Henry Bracy. Lefroy promised Bracy exclusive rights to the opera and set about finding a composer to counterfeit the work. But then, in May 1881, Lefroy heard a sickening rumour. Violet, his Violet, was engaged.
She never ever met him, but he always seemed to think that he had actually declared his love and that she declared her love for him.
I don't think there can be any doubt that he was dangerously obsessed with the idea of somehow getting close to Violet Cameron.
Lefroy kept to his room by day. At night, he wandered the streets in a fog of jealousy and rage. Then he changed his plans. Lefroy told the tenor, Henry Bracy, that his wealthy benefactor had died. The Offenbach manuscript had been left to Lefroy, as well as £1,000 a year, and that would rise to £10,000 should Lefroy marry. He was convinced that Bracy could introduce him to Violet, and she would have no excuse to turn him down. There was just one problem. Lefroy could pose as a rich man. He fancied that he had the manners and the bearing, but he couldn't write an opera. He found a composer to forge it, but the man wanted £50. £50 Lefroy didn't have.
Percy Lefroy Mapleton at that stage was presumably even more desperate than normal. He seemed to have run out of money completely.
He's put himself in a position where he needs to pay £50 to a composer if he's going to be able to produce anything, to be able to carry through his scheme, at least to meet Violet, even if it never gets staged. He's got money owing, he's got goods in pawn, and he has absolutely no legitimate income.
Lefroy despaired. He had promised Bracy the opera by July. He'd pawned his best clothes and owed money all over town. But then, a miracle. A friend who owed Lefroy 10 guineas promised to lend him £100. On the 24th of June, Lefroy met the man at Charing Cross Station. His friend cheerfully handed him a cheque, then dashed away to his train. Lefroy, giddy with excitement, hurried to the bank. But his friend had lied. The cheque was no good. There was no money. All Lefroy's promises and his grand plans came crashing down. In a matter of days, he would be exposed as a charlatan, and his dream of winning Violet's heart would crumble. He had to do something. On Monday, the 27th of June, 1881, Percy Lefroy Mapleton woke late. He lived with his cousin Annie and her family in the town of Wallington, South London. He told them he worked as a journalist for the Era newspaper, but that was just another lie. His days were spent obsessing over the young actress Violet Cameron and scheming up ways to win her heart. Lefroy was desperate for money. His debts were growing. His opera scam was about to fall apart. But that Monday, he swore, was the day he would fix all that.
There is this crisis. He hasn't got the Offenbach script. He's in debt. He's pawning his clothes. He is a desperate man.
He thought somehow or other in his mind, perhaps, that if he could steal some money by some means or other, then his problems would be solved and he would move on to realise his ambitions.
I think it's a measure of just how deep his obsession was, that he doesn't seem to look beyond a desperate scheme to acquire money.
Just before 10 a.m., Lefroy called for his favourite nephew, Melville. He had an errand for the boy. He pressed a letter into the 7-year-old's hand and asked him to run it over to a nearby newsagent. Melville delivered the letter to Albert Ellis at his shop. It said that Melville's mother, the heavily pregnant Annie, had an order to place and asked Mr. Ellis to please call on them at once. After luring the newsagent away, Lefroy snuck out of the house and around the corner to the shop. He owed Ellis more than £1 and told the young assistant left in charge he wished to settle his bill. Lefroy handed the teenager an envelope telling him it had 2 sovereigns in it. The shop boy gave him 13 shillings in change. The teenager didn't open the envelope until Lefroy had left, and inside were a single shilling and 2 worthless antique medals. Having settled his debt and made a pretty profit doing so, Lefroy hurried away to Wallington Station. He caught the 10:49 train to London Bridge. It was time for the next part of his plan. He headed for Borough High Street. At number 25 stood the Adams and Hilstead pawnbrokers.
London was saturated with pawnbrokers at the time, and we need not think of this necessarily as something that was just for the destitute.
You pledge an article and you can borrow money against that article, and then when you've got the money back again, you can redeem it.
If the ticket wasn't redeemed at the declared time, then the pawnbroker would sell the items and make his profit that way.
The pawnbroker's function was there to enable you to keep up a facade of respectability. It's absolutely telling that the 2 busiest days for the pawnbroker were Saturday and Monday. You get your wages, you go, you redeem your Sunday best, you wear it out for whatever purpose, and then come Monday, you brush it down, make it look as respectable as you possibly can, and you return it to pawn.
Lefroy was a regular customer at the pawnbrokers. He'd pledged an overcoat there for 10 shillings. He'd got more than £1 for his dress suit, and he'd received another 5 shillings for a 6-chambered revolver. On the morning of the 27th of June, Lefroy came to get his pistol back.
Well, someone who was using pawn shops to quite the excessive degree that Lefroy was is suggestive of rather a roguish, shadowy figure.
We're not talking about lots of money, we're talking about 5 shillings or £1 or 10 shillings, tiny sums of money, all of which help him exist on a sort of a day-to-day basis.
It suggests someone who's on the margins of deprivation, who doesn't have a secure, solid, respectable, grounded existence, which is what the Victorians told people they should aspire to.
Lefroy returned to London Bridge. He bought a first-class ticket for Brighton. In the waiting room, under cover of a newspaper, he loaded his gun. It was nearly 2 o'clock. The Brighton Express train was getting ready to depart when Lefroy hurried down the platform.
They're all individual compartments in those days, so you couldn't get on at one part of the train and walk down the corridor to find who you were looking for.
He'd hoped to commit a robbery without violence, that simply waving the pistol in the face of some timid commuter would enable him to commit a robbery and get away with it. But it was so ill thought through.
He spotted a man sat alone in a first-class compartment. He was eating strawberries. Lefroy climbed in. 2 minutes later, the train pulled out of London Bridge Station. And soon, row after row of tightly packed streets were flashing by the window. But faced with the reality of what he had planned, Lefroy faltered. Every time he glanced at the man seemed to stare back. Lefroy grew nervous.
The man was looking at him in a peculiar way. Well, Percy Lefroy Mapleton was a bit odd himself.
Now, we know subsequently from other evidence that the man was George Austin. Now, Lefroy thinks from the man's stares that he knows that Lefroy is going to attack him, is going to kill him. He becomes frightened. What he doesn't know is that Austin is staring at him because Austin is incredibly short-sighted. And he's staring at him to try and focus, but Lefroy completely misinterprets it.
Lefroy could bear it no longer. At East Croydon, he got out. And further down the train, he saw another man sitting alone in another first-class compartment. He was dozing with a handkerchief over his head. Lefroy reboarded the train. This time, he told himself, he wouldn't hesitate. If dear Violet was to be his, now was the time for courage. The train accelerated to its top speed of 50 miles an hour. It whistled into the darkness of Merstham Tunnel. The train sped on south. Soon it rattled past the cottage of Anne Brown in Hawley. Through the windows of her front room, Mrs. Brown and her daughter had a clear view of the passengers inside.
According to the two women, they were watching the trains go by, just passing an idle hour.
They thought they saw two men fighting together in one of the compartments.
It's very difficult to know for certain, but I suspect that they at least saw something, the beginnings of an attack.
The train was soon approaching the outskirts of Brighton. At 3:20 p.m, it pulled into Preston Park Station, 1.5 miles north of the town centre. Waiting on the platform was ticket collector Richard Gibson. As the train slowed, he saw a man leaning out of a first-class compartment, beckoning to him.
Immediately he saw something wrong because he wasn't wearing a hat. All men wore hats. And not only did he have no hat, but he was covered in blood.
He was in a very physically shaken state. He was in a very mentally shaken state.
When they looked at him, they looked at his feet, and from his shoe, they could see that there was a gold chain. So the ticket collector pulled on the gold chain, and then came out a gold watch from his shoe. He said, "Well, what's this?" And Percy Lefroy Mapleton said, "Well, I don't know anything about this."
Later on, he claims that it was his watch and chain which he'd actually put into his shoe for safekeeping.
I think he was just in a state of shock. a state of panic, and he never subsequently achieved real clarity.
Another ticket collector and the station master gathered around Lefroy. He told the railwaymen that he'd been attacked on board, fired at 3 or 4 times, and struck over the head with a blunt instrument. The compartment was covered in blood. There were bullet holes in the cushions, there were bloody fingerprints on the footboard. But there was no sign of the man with the handkerchief. Percy Lefroy Mapleton was a good liar. He always had been. And now found blooded and bruised in a train compartment at Preston Park. He had quite the story to tell.
Initially, the railway staff are puzzled. They can't make any sense of Lefroy's story.
He says that he'd been attacked by 2 men, one a countryman and the other an old gentleman.
He very quickly changes his story so that the elderly gentleman isn't attacking him, it's only the countryman. The elderly gentleman sort of disappears, except that later on he reappears and the countryman disappears briefly, and it is the elderly gentleman who is attacking him.
They saw that he was obviously in a state, so the station master made sure that the ticket collector got back on the train with Percy Lefroy Mapleton, and they took him down the line to Brighton to the end. At Brighton, the police inspector started to question Percy Lefroy Mapleton and exactly what had happened.
As Lefroy was spinning his tale, 20 miles away, a railway plate layer was walking with his nephew through Balcombe Tunnel. Thomas Jennings was employed to inspect and maintain the tracks. With a naphtha lamp to light the way, Jennings walked the length of the soot-black tunnel, eyes peeled for any damage or obstruction. At around 4 p.m, he spotted something.
They saw a bundle, a heap, lying by the side of the track, and initially thought that something had been thrown out of a train window. They get closer and they realise it's a body.
He was obviously dead. They found some correspondence with his name on, and so they could identify him.
The dead man was Frederick Isaac Gold. He was 64 years old and lived with his wife Lydia just a few hundred yards from Preston Park Station. On the 27th of June, Gold had left home early and caught the 8:45 train from Brighton to London Bridge.
It was a regular trip that he took. He had retired to Preston Park. He had spent a long and successful career as a master baker. He'd had a series of shops that in his early 60s he'd sold off.
But he keeps one shop on because he looks on this as potentially as being something which he could hand on to his 14-year-old nephew.
He was not running it on a day-to-day basis, but he still maintained an interest. He was still the big boss. And so he would go up, check that things were well, inspect the takings, and take them home with him.
That morning, there were £38, 5 shillings and a penny. And Gold deposited the money at his bank in Whitechapel and prepared for the trip home. Just before 2 p.m, he took a seat in a first-class compartment on the Brighton Express. 2 hours after Gold boarded the train in London, his body was found in Balcombe Tunnel. The fall from the train had inflicted terrible injuries. Gold's skull was crushed and his leg gashed open, but he'd been through an ordeal even before that. A bullet was found in his spine, and the doctors counted 14 different knife wounds on his body. It was clear Frederick Gold had suffered a vicious assault. But news of the discovery in the tunnel didn't reach Brighton immediately. There, police were wondering what to do with the strange young man who'd got off the train at Preston Park.
Because of his blood-stained appearance, they got him taken to hospital and cleaned up. And in fact, the doctors at the hospital sort of clarified that actually he only had very superficial scratches. He didn't have any serious injuries at all.
What they think is that Lefroy had expected to make away with himself in a state of temporary insanity and was still suffering from that.
They gave him to Detective Sergeant George Holmes to accompany back to his lodgings in Wallington.
Lefroy boarded the 6:10 train for London. When the train stopped at Balcombe Station, the detectives heard about the man found dead in the tunnel. But they didn't suspect Lefroy. At East Croydon, they received a telegram asking them to check the serial number of the watch spotted in Lefroy's shoe. The number Lefroy gave didn't match the watch. But still, the police did not suspect him.
The real mistake is made by Holmes, who has clearly been lulled into a sense of false security and doesn't take Lefroy seriously.
Thinking of him as a potential suicide, the police tended to treat him with sort of kid gloves, and they were quite sympathetic to him.
George Holmes knows that a dead body has been found, knows that Mapleton's possession of the watch is distinctly suspicious, but nevertheless carries on to Croydon with him, takes a cab and takes him to his address in Wallington.
After taking a written statement, the officer wished Lefroy a good night. The detective walked around the corner to Wallington Station. An urgent telegram was waiting for him there. It said Lefroy was not to be let out of his sight. The policeman hurried back to the house in Cathcart Road. He'd not been gone 10 minutes, but Percy Lefroy Mapleton had vanished.
The police investigation was completely bungled at this point.
It was pretty clear that he was the main murder suspect. He'd been effectively in police custody, and the police had let him go.
Police scoured the country for Lefroy. Detectives could find no photograph of their fugitive, and they relied instead on a drawing by the owner of the King's Arms in Carshalton. Lefroy had been a regular there, and the publican knew him well. The sketch found its way to the press. On the 1st of July, it was published in the Daily Telegraph.
This is the first time such a thing had been amplified by the full might of the British mass media, which was described around about the same time as the nerve centre of the world.
We know that in the first days after the publishing of the sketch, that it nearly sent the police pretty much across the country round the bend.
People thought they'd seen him or might have seen him all over the country, because remember, the Daily Telegraph in London, it's read in the furthest flung pockets of the country.
One man was arrested on the mail train from Paddington to Devon, but it turned out not to be the right man. One man was arrested in Shoebury-Ness in Essex. Again, he was eliminated.
Anybody who broadly looked like Lefroy, or rather like that drawing, was likely to find himself being the focus of very much unwanted attention.
Lefroy was, in fact, still in London. After 3 days wandering the streets, he had found his way to a lodging house in Stepney. He pretended to be an engraver from Liverpool, newly arrived in the city. He kept to his room, barely venturing out. It wasn't the first time the 21-year-old had been on the run from the police. In 1878, he had posed as a theatrical manager and engaged a company of actors to perform a play in Gloucester. It seemed the 18-year-old Lefroy planned to abscond with the box office takings. But when the company arrived in Gloucester, Lefroy was nowhere to be found. The play never went ahead, and the furious actors began hounding Lefroy for compensation. When police began to take an interest in the affair, the young man decided a trip abroad was advisable for his health. In December 1878, he left for Australia.
Now, he's obviously made some money out of this scam, because a man who is generally short of cash gets on this boat to Australia and he's got some £40 in cash.
I don't think he's really got any practical plans beyond that.
By the time he reaches Australia, he's lost £7 of it. But it says he lands in Australia, he's got a good suit and £32 of cash. So for a time, he starts enjoying himself, goes to regattas, theatres, and he's enjoying himself and living quite comfortably. Then he suddenly realises that the money is running out.
Lefroy wired his family for more funds. Instead, they sent him a ticket home. By the end of September 1879, he was back in England. He'd scorned the chance of a new start.
He's out of the country for about 9.5 months. And 4.5 months of that he's in Australia. The rest of the time he's travelling backwards and forwards between Britain and Australia.
He's learned no lesson from that, except that actually people are willing to listen to a scheme that offers them the possibility of profit.
He returned to London and to his obsession with the young actress Violet Cameron. It was an obsession that would lead him to murder. But killing Frederick Gold had earned Lefroy little more than a few shillings and a gold watch. By the 7th of July, after 10 days a fugitive, he was growing desperate. He could not hide forever. He had to flee or face capture. He composed a telegram and asked his landlady to send it. It was a secret message to his cousin Frank. Percy Lefroy Mapleton was planning an escape. The telegram that arrived at the office of solicitor J.T. Hutchinson was a confusing one. It was from a man calling himself Mr. Clark and requested his wages be delivered to an address in Stepney that evening. But nobody by that name worked at the office, and the last line of the telegram was even more baffling. Flower tomorrow, not 33. The telegram was intended for Frank Seal. Seal was a general copying clerk at the solicitor's office. He was also Percy Lefroy Mapleton's cousin.
I think he's decided that he's not cut out for robbery, so he has to try something else.
This is a sort of a desperate way of trying to get in touch with Frank for him to come and see him and help him out with some money.
But if the telegram contained a coded cry for help, Seal didn't understand it. Lefroy's desperate gambit would only succeed in bringing the police straight to his door. The landlady at Lefroy's lodging house in Stepney had grown suspicious of her tenant, and on the 8th of July she sent her daughter to J.T. Hutchinson's to find out more about the mysterious newcomer.
She's told that nobody of that name works there, but she then gets chatting with one of the clerks, and tells the clerk of her mother's suspicions about their lodger. The clerk quickly realises who she's talking about, that it's Lefroy. And so that evening, after work, he goes to Scotland Yard, tells them where they can find Lefroy, and he gets the £200 reward.
At 7:45 on the evening of the 8th of July, a cab pulled up outside the Stepney lodging house. Inside were 3 policemen. One guarded the front of the house, one the back, and one went inside. Percy Lefroy Mapleton was sat in his room upstairs. He denied the murder, but did not resist arrest. The manhunt was over.
He was tracked down because of his desperation for money, more than anything else.
Scotland Yard eventually arrested Percy Mapleton 10 days after the murder, and he was put on trial down at Maidstone Assizes.
Lefroy's trial began on Friday the 4th of November 1881. Lefroy told another version of the story he'd first told the ticket inspectors at Preston Park. He was innocent. He'd been attacked by a mysterious countryman who robbed and murdered Frederick Gold, stuffed Mr. Gold's watch in Lefroy's shoe, and then jumped off a speeding train, never to be seen again. It was not a compelling defense.
The defence could have argued for insanity, but because of Lefroy's insistence on the third person being in the coach, such a defence is impossible. It can't be argued.
Montague Williams, his defence counsel, commented that any time that he saw journalists paying attention to him, he seemed to preen, to respond. What he had attempted to do before appearing in the dock was redeem his evening clothes from pawn. He wanted to turn up in full evening dress in the dock.
He thought this would impress the jury. What he was allowed to have was his silk hat, which he had kept on the ledge in front of him, and he would often be toying with that or turning it and looking at it.
He spends much of the trial focusing on that, almost to the exclusion of anything else. He spends very little time responding to what is going on around him.
Lefroy was so convinced his story would be believed, he'd booked a cab to whisk him away after his acquittal. But the jury didn't share his delusions. After just 10 minutes deliberation, they returned to court with a verdict of guilty. Lefroy was sentenced to death. Before he was taken away, he turned to the jury. "Someday, when too late," he said, "you will learn that you have murdered me." He was taken from Maidstone Crown Court to the prison in Lewes, and it was there he would face execution. Lefroy had 3 weeks to live. At first, it seems he still believed he might escape his fate. He clung to his story about the murderous countryman. Then he tried to confess to another killing, hoping an investigation might postpone his execution. But the authorities dismissed his claims, as they did his solicitor's plea of insanity. As the end drew near, Lefroy looked back at his short and eventful life. He began to write.
The autobiography that Lefroy wrote in prison is rather a bizarre but quite mesmerising blend of fact, fiction, fantasy, outright lies, and earnest confession.
He describes his emotions, his sensations. He describes how he came to the desperate and horrid conclusion that he had no choice but robbery. He makes himself almost the hero of an adventure story.
He's packed his sentences full of drama, and it was beautifully overwritten and colourful and garish and sort of leapt out at you. He's still trying to leave a legacy, still trying to have some kind of monument to what had become, sadly, rather a pitiful and murderous existence.
In high-flown language, Lefroy told his story, a tangle of fact and fantasy that is hard even now to unravel. But he made one thing clear. He did kill Frederick Gold.
He said that he had been trying to steal some money. Frederick Gold had put his handkerchief over his head and fallen asleep, and his purse had fallen down on the floor. And he could see there were some coins there. And he'd been tempted to pick them up, but as soon as he moved, Frederick Gold immediately jumped up and accused him of trying to steal his purse and his money from the floor.
He indicates that he only turned to murder when Gold fought back, when he was taken by surprise.
And he blurs the actual moment of Mr. Gold's disappearance out of the carriage. And the door opens, there is darkness, a scream, a yell. It conjures up the atmosphere, but we've not got specific details.
It showed absolutely no moral consciousness of having done something wrong. And it's that aspect which really strongly comes across in the autobiography, that he is not sorry for what he has done.
Percy Lefroy Mapleton murdered Frederick Gold, and he did it for Violet Cameron. His obsession with the famous actress remained undimmed, and from his condemned cell he wrote to her. Soon he was telling his solicitor that she'd written back. Violet had forgiven him, he said, and even enclosed flowers for the poor or doomed man. The actress, of course, had done no such thing. Her only response to Lefroy came in a letter to the Daily Telegraph. She had never met him or exchanged words with him. She had no idea who he was. His delusions had made a thief of Percy Lefroy Mapleton. They had made him a murderer. And on the morning of the 29th of November 1881, they carried him to the gallows.